Imagine this. It is 1949. You are sitting on your front porch on a warm August morning when the neighborhood paperboy throws you today's paper. And it reads, Pastor tells eerie tale of haunted boy. What? A haunted boy? That can't be real. In the following days, a few more articles come out about this haunted boy. One headline sends a chill down your spine. Priest frees Mount Rainier boy reported held in devil's grip. A boy possessed by the devil? No way, that just cannot be true. But your pulse quickens as you skim the article, uneasy at every detail that you read. And over the next few weeks, you cannot escape it. More headlines appear, more stories circulate. Witnesses claim they saw the unthinkable with their own eyes. 48 of them, in fact, saw this boy possessed. The whole town is buzzing. Actually, the whole world is buzzing about this haunted boy. This can't be real, can it? In 1949, a young boy from Maryland became the center of one of the most infamous cases of alleged demonic possession ever recorded. His story would later inspire the movie The Exorcist, which is said to be one of the most terrifying films of all time. But what really happened to that young boy that they called Roland Doe? Was he truly possessed, or was there something else going on? Something that we still can't explain to this day. Hi everyone, I'm April, and welcome back to Spooky Time with April. If you love chilling stories of paranormal, haunted history, and mysteries that keep you up at night, you're in the right place. Today, we are diving into the infamous case of Roland Doe, the boy whose exorcisms inspired the movie The Exorcist. William Peter Blatty first caught wind of this case in 1949 after reading a headline in the newspaper. This single article would spark his imagination, and he would go on to write a novel called The Exorcist. And then the blockbuster movie, The Exorcist, would come out a little bit later. But how true is the real life story? I mean, if nearly 50 witnesses saw the things that they claim they saw, then some of it has to be true, right? The truth is, it's not so simple. Fact and fiction have blurred over the years. Newspapers sensationalized the story, and later Hollywood twisted it even further. But beneath all the exaggerations and the legends, something undeniably strange happened to Roland and his family in 1949. I read many articles, books, and watched a few documentaries about this case, and I'll have all the sources linked in the description below. The 2 books and a magazine article I read that gave me the most information included Possessed, a true story of an exorcism by Thomas Allen, The Devil Came to St. Louis, the uncensored true story of the 1949 exorcism by Troy Taylor, and then the magazine article The Haunted Boy of Cottage City by Mark Obsasinic. Before we begin, this story contains topics of demonic possession, mental illness, alleged child abuse, and the victim in the story is a 13-year-old boy who is the center of all the disturbing events, so viewer discretion is advised. Let's get into the story of Roland Doe. For decades, the true identity of the haunted boy remained a mystery. He was only known by his pseudonyms Roland Doe, Robbie, or simply R. But after his death in 2021, his true identity was finally revealed. His name was Ronald Edwin Hunkeler. So from now on, I'm gonna call him Ronald instead of Roland. Ronald was born on June 1st, 1935. He grew up in Cottage City, Maryland, which is a small town about a mile from Washington, D.C. When this story first came into the newspapers in 1949, everyone insisted that he was from Mount Rainier. This might have been just a way to keep his identity a secret, because the church, everyone involved in his exorcism, didn't want people to know about who he was. Maybe they just kind of lied about his hometown. But he's not from Mount Rainier, he is from Cottage City, or at least he grew up in Cottage City. So Ronald's childhood was allegedly complicated. His father Edwin grew up Catholic, but he didn't really practice the religion anymore, and he apparently worked a lot, so he wasn't really around too much. His mother Odell was Lutheran, and she was described as overbearing, and his grandmother Anna was from Germany, so she moved in with the family after her husband died, and her English wasn't very good since it was her second language. I assume German was her first language. obviously. So Odell had to translate for her quite often. And Anna was Lutheran, and she was described as quite religious. And being the only child, Ronald grew up in the constant presence of his mom, Odell, and his grandmother, Anna. And apparently Ronald had a favorite relative. Her name was Matilda, and everyone called her Aunt Tilly. She lived in St. Louis, Missouri, and she was rumored to be a spiritualist. She dabbled in seances and the occult. And according to a very popular version of the story, Aunt Tilly introduced Ronald to the Ouija board. Quick side note, is it pronounced Ouija or Ouija? Because I just recently learned that some people call it Ouija, but all my life growing up, whenever I watched scary movies, I swear they all said Ouija. So honestly, I have no idea. I think I'm gonna continue to say Ouija because that's just how I've always said it. And it seems like from my research, that's like the consensus.
Ouija board.
But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comment how you would pronounce it. So anyway, the Ouija board, also known as the talking board or the witch board, or some people might say the demon board. It looks harmless at first glance. It's just a flat board with numbers, letters, and then the words yes and no. And then it comes with this triangular sliding, what do they call it, planchet. I think the idea is to like talk to it, like ask questions. Either the spirit or like subconsciously, the little triangular pointy thing will slide across the board and spell out different words, or it will go to the yes or no thing if you ask a question. So yeah, I've never done it, honestly. I don't know if I want to, but if I get 1 million views on this video, I'll buy one and I'll record myself using it. God, if this video got 1 million views and then I used one, then I got possessed, that'd be so bad. So anyways, it's supposed to be a game initially, I believe. Like, I haven't done a deep dive on the Ouija board yet, but I plan to. But it seems like it's supposed to be like just this fun little game. Some believe it's a tool to communicate with the dead, a doorway to something beyond, sometimes something dark. Christians, especially Catholics, have long warned against using a Ouija board. They call it dangerous and some call it satanic. And this is where Ronald's story becomes tangled up with a legend. Some claim that Aunt Tilly and Ronald used the Ouija board together and they unknowingly opened this door to the dark side to let the demons in or whatever. That's what some people claim. It does make for a chilling explanation as to why Ronald and his family were being tormented and allegedly possessed. And it's similar to what happens in the movie The Exorcist. The young girl, Reagan, she finds a Ouija board, she plays with it, and she claims that she was talking to a spirit, somebody by the name of Captain Howdy. And then soon after, her life became tormented, she became possessed, and all these crazy, wild, terrible things started happening to her. She became possessed by an ancient demon called Pazuzu, not Labubu. Those are different. But here's the thing. The first mention of Ronald using a Ouija board doesn't even appear until after the novel, The Exorcist, and the movie come out. So this connection may have been added later on to kind of explain why Ronald may have potentially become possessed. Can you imagine being possessed in this era of TikTok? Come with me to go get exercise. This is day 6-7 of being possessed by Pazuzu the Labubu. Okay, moving on. In 1949, in January, everything changed for the Hunkeler family. Ronald was only 13 years old when the strange events began. On January 15th, it all started with this dripping noise that echoed through the house. Ronald and his grandmother Anna were searching all throughout the house trying to find any leaky pipes. So they went into Anna's room and the dripping noise got louder. And then all of a sudden they looked up at the wall where there was a picture, a painting of Jesus, and it started shaking and it was like moving kind of back and forth as if something or somebody was on the other side of the wall, like hitting the wall and causing the painting to shake. So when Ronald's parents came home, the dripping noise stopped, but a new noise started up that night, a scratching noise like a cat's claws that were being dragged across the wooden floor. Everyone thought it was mice, so the next day they called the exterminator, but he never found any traces of rodents. And the scratching noise started up every night from 7 p.m. and it lasted through most of the night, and then it would stop and it would start up again the next night at the exact same time. And around this time, Odell makes this unhinged theory as to why they were experiencing experiencing these strange noises. Maybe it's Aunt Tilly. Maybe she's the reason behind all this. You know, she likes to talk to the dead, use the Ouija board. So maybe she let in some spirit, some evil entity. And not long after this accusation, Aunt Tilly dies on January 26th. But now Odell believes it is Aunt Tilly herself that's haunting them. And honestly, there's like no explanation as to why Aunt Tilly would be haunting, tormenting them. Apparently, Odell and Anna did not like Aunt Tilly. There's no reason, explanation, but it seemed like they didn't like each other for some reason. I don't know why. So Aunt Tilly died 11 days after the beginning of the first noise on January 15th. And around the time of her death, a new noise began. A squeaking noise, like shoes on a basketball court pacing up and down Ronald's bed. One night, Anna and Odell slept with Ronald to hear this new noise for themselves, and this time there was a different noise. It was like marching to the sound of a drum beat. So at this point, Odell was annoyed, she was over it. So she asked out loud, "Aunt Tilly, if this is you, you better knock 3 times." And then, right as she asked this, Odell, Anna, and Ronald experienced this wave of pressure, 3 waves of pressure, and then they heard 3 knocks. And just to be sure, Odell asked again, "Aunt Tilly, if this is really you, knock 4 times." And then the same thing happened. They felt 4 waves of pressure go through them, and then they heard 4 knocks. And then right after the knocks, a scratching noise started up again, but not on the wood floor. It was heard coming from Ronald's mattress. And then the ends of the covers like flew up as if somebody was holding the covers. Whatever was holding it let go, and the covers just flew back down into their place. The way I would have just bounced so quick, that would have terrified me. No way they just stayed in that room, slept through the night. Anyways, so after this night, things escalated quick. Furniture was moving, objects were flying through the air, a Bible flew from the table at Ronald's feet, a kitchen table flipped over, a big chair that Ronald was sitting in just tipped over by itself. And the strange things didn't just happen at Ronald's house, it seemed to follow Ronald wherever he went. At school, Ronald was sitting in, his little desk, and apparently the desk moved around on its own across the classroom. Suspicion did grow that Ronald was pulling a prank, like this was all a joke, he was fooling everybody. But Ronald apparently denied it every time, saying like, "It's not me, I'm not doing it." So eventually Ronald's parents took him out of school and they went to go seek out some medical help. Apparently one doctor called him high-strung. What a very legit medical diagnosis. High-strung means extremely nervous, sensitive, can easily become upset or excited, and often reacting to stress very strongly. Why does this low-key sound like me though, for real? Am I high-strung? Hey babe, am I high-strung?
Sometimes.
Oh.
You're high-strung like our kitties.
Reportedly, Ronald did go to the county mental hygiene clinic. Apparently there's no records that he actually went, so I don't know how true this part is, but at some point he did go see, I think, like some psychiatrists. But for the most part, everyone said that he was normal, which I find hard to believe, because if you were to tell a doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist that you are seeing a piece of fruit fly through the air, it sounds like, hallucinations if you don't believe, like poltergeist stuff, which we'll get into later, or like demons, possession, whatever. Doesn't sound very normal to me if you're seeing that kind of thing happen. But back then, medical treatment for mental illness was not very great. This was the late 1940s, and apparently it was looked down on, kind of like shameful, if you were diagnosed with a mental illness and you had to be admitted to like a mental institute. So I'm sure Ronald's parents didn't want him to be diagnosed with a mental illness, so maybe they lied and said that they saw psychiatrists, or they did see psychiatrists and they just lied about what they were seeing, so he didn't sound crazy. So eventually they turned to their Lutheran pastor, Reverend Luther Miles Scholes. At first he did assume it was like mischief, like he was pulling a prank, but during several visits to the house, Scholes claimed that he did see objects flying, furniture moving. So now Scholes suspected that something paranormal was happening, but he didn't think it was demons. He didn't really believe in that kind of stuff, but he did believe in extrasensory perception, ESP for short. And this is in the realm of parapsychology, which is the study of unexplainable events that can't be explained by conventional science. ESP involves telepathy, which is the ability to send thoughts from your mind to someone else's mind. Also clairvoyance, which is the ability to perceive or know things that you wouldn't ordinarily know, and psychokinesis, which is the ability to move objects with your mind. Scholes believed that Ronald was psychokinetic and was unconsciously moving objects around his house without him knowing, like it was coming from him. And apparently psychokinesis mostly manifests in troubled young people, like in their teens, like when they hit adolescent, like puberty. But Scholes ended up keeping this theory to himself. He didn't tell the Hunkelers about it. So instead, he searched for a more religious theory versus a paranormal one. While Scholes was trying to find an explanation and some type of intervention to help the family, things for the Hunkelers just kept getting worse and worse. One night, a dresser in Ronald's room magically just dragged itself across the room in front of the door, and the drawers in the dresser were opening and closing by themselves. Another night, Ronald was completely asleep, and apparently he was just screaming obscenities, like nasty things. So now Scholes has a plan. He decided to take Ronald to his house to spend the night to see if the strange events would happen there. So on February 17th, this is a little over a month later when everything just began, Ronald spends one night at Scholes' house. They sleep in the same room in their own twin-sized bed, and that night, sometime around midnight, Scholes wakes up to a really loud sound. He looks over at Ronald, who is sleeping peacefully in his bed, but the bed is shaking vigorously, like really fast. Scholes wakes up Ronald and says, "We gotta get out of here." So they go into the kitchen and they make some hot cocoa. So then Scholes was like, "Hey Ronald, you need to sleep in this big armchair." So Ronald gets in the chair. He brings his knees up like this, I guess to get comfortable. And then all of a sudden, the chair levitates a little bit, and then it moves backwards, and then it slowly just tips over, and Ronald goes flying out of it. Okay, plan C. So Scholes creates a little bed on the floor using a bunch of blankets, and he's like, "Okay, Ronald, you gotta sleep here on the floor." So they go to sleep again, and then Scholes wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he looks over at Ronald, and Ronald is moving while he's sleeping on the pile of blankets. The whole thing with Ronald is moving under the bed, and then once he's under the bed, he starts like bouncing up and down. He eventually hits his head at the bottom of the bed where the bed springs are, so it like wakes him up. So after witnessing all this, Scholes allegedly told the Hunkelers to seek out a Catholic priest. Apparently Scholes said this was not his area of expertise and that the Catholics would know more about this stuff. So Scholes was hinting that this was potentially a demonic possession, even though apparently he didn't believe in it, but I guess he didn't really know what else to do for whatever was going on. So I'm not sure how true this next event is, but apparently an unnamed minister, likely Scholes, contacted Dr. J.B. Ryan, who was the director of the Duke University Parapsychology Lab in 1949. The unnamed minister wanted his opinion on poltergeist activity. So poltergeist activity, also known as noisy ghosts, typically involves a teenager and noisy, unexplainable things happening, such as like thumping noise, scratching, tapping, knocking, things like you can't find the source of these sounds, and also objects moving around. J.B. Ryan concluded that the mysterious things that were happening to Ronald was likely psychokinesis. He also told the minister to be cautious of fraud or trickery by the boy. And also Dr. Ryan said that discussions of demonic possession could really influence a young, impressionable boy. So it's best to avoid talking about possession and demons around Ronald. But of course, the advice was not followed. Since Scholes told him to go seek out a Catholic priest, this suggested that demonic possession could be at play. I don't know if the 13-year-old boy would catch on to something like this, but maybe the parents did, and we don't know what happened behind closed doors, like what the parents told the boy. So anyways, after Scholes told them to go seek out the priest, Ronald's dad, Edwin, called up their local Catholic rectory at St. James, and he talked to a priest named Father Albert Hughes. So this next part I'm about to tell you, take it with a little grain of salt. Actually, take a grain of salt for this entire story because it's hard to know what's really true and what's not true. So the next morning, the Hunkelers go to meet Father Hughes at the church, and apparently this meeting was very uncomfy, and not because Father Hughes was Catholic and the Hunkelers were Lutheran. Apparently there was some kind of beef going on with religions. I don't know. Anyways, I don't know if that's still going on, but maybe back then there was like little tension. But it was because Ronald was apparently acting up. He was cussing at the priest, the room was ice cold, and then a phone slid across the desk by itself. Immediately, Hughes was frightened, of course, and he did not give the idea of demonic possession and the need for an exorcism a second thought. At the end of the meeting, Hughes did give the Hunkelers some holy water and some blessed candles, and then he went on to ask the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., which was O'Boyle, for permission to perform an exorcism. But before we get into that wild story, let me tell you a little bit more about possession. So possession is defined as the presence of a spirit or an entity that occupies and controls the physical body of a subject. Demonic possession is very much believed, I believe, in both the Catholic religion and the Christian religion. It's been suggested that possession can be invited or may occur because of studying the occult, practicing black magic, using a Ouija board. It's also been suggested that overwhelming stress, anger, and violence can also invite a demon to possess you. Signs of a demonic possession include abnormal movements of your body, incredible strength and powers that are beyond the natural ability of that person, speaking an unusual language, or being able to understand the language that you didn't already know, and revealing future or hidden events. So back at home, it was either Anna or Adele. One of them sprinkled holy water all throughout the house, and then she went to go light one of the blessed candles, but apparently when she lit the candle, the flame shot up so high to the ceiling. So of course she freaked out, blew out the candle, so she went and burned the house down. And then apparently later on, the bottle of holy water flew off the table and then just shattered on the floor. So the family told Father Hughes what had happened, and then Hughes decided to go to their home to see for himself. He apparently heard the boy speak in Latin, which is a language he didn't already know, and this is a classic sign of demonic possession, especially speaking Latin. So eventually the Archbishop O'Boyle did give permission for Father Hughes to be the exorcist. And this is interesting because Father Hughes is very young at this time. He's not very experienced, and he does not have the knowledge of exorcism or demonology. I don't know why O'Boyle would pick him to be the exorcist. So apparently Father Hughes decided that the best place to perform the exorcism would be in a hospital where Ronald could be restrained in the bed. Ronald was admitted to the Georgetown University Hospital, and somewhere between February 27th and March 6th, the exorcism was performed. Apparently Father Hughes saw the bed shaking, objects flying, Ronald was cussing in a different language. So now this next part is going to leave you speechless. While Father Hughes was saying the Latin prayers that must be said during the rite of exorcism, Ronald, who was restrained in the bed, somehow was able to wiggle one of his hands out of the restraints. He reached underneath the bed, he snatched off a bed spring, and then very quickly he slashed Father Hughes's arm all the way from his shoulder down to his wrist. That's a really bad wound. Father Hughes needed 100 stitches to close up that wound. So of course the exorcism ended right then and there, and it was known as the botched exorcism. And apparently after this, Father Hughes suffered a mental breakdown, and then he disappeared. One person saw him at some other church preaching. This part of the story is really funny to me, and I know what you're thinking, how can you be laughing at something like this? Sounds terrible. It's a horrific, traumatic event, right? Well, it's funny because it's not true. None of those things I just told you about the exorcism, about them even meeting Father Hughes in person, it didn't even happen. The only thing that Father Hughes did was send them some candles and some holy water. If you read some of the books that I told you earlier, there is sufficient evidence that this event did not happen. Church records do not indicate that Father Hughes suffered a mental breakdown and that the exorcism didn't even happen. That would be very well documented if there was an exorcism that was approved by the church. And those who knew Father Hughes personally do not remember seeing him with a nasty injury like that. And also during this time, Father Hughes was very busy. He was a part of the church still. He never disappeared and went to another church. He was performing wedding ceremonies and masses and I think funeral things. So he was very busy. Someone created this wild story. More crazy things kept getting added onto it, and it just went on to be this new thing added to the legend of Ronald. But he was actually admitted to the Georgetown University Hospital from February 28th to March 6th, where he did undergo some medical testing, psychological testing to try to figure out what was going on. So that part is true. So around this time, after he left the hospital, Ronald's parents were discussing maybe moving to a new location location temporarily just to see if maybe things would kind of go away if they got out of the house for a bit. They talked about going to St. Louis, Missouri, where both Edwin and Odell had relatives living. And then a strange event occurred that would solidify their decision to go to St. Louis. One night while Ronald was getting ready for bed, like he always does, he looked in the bathroom mirror and he screamed. His parents came running up to see what was happening, and Ronald opened up his pajama shirt, and scratched on his chest was the word Louis. His mother saw this and was like, we gotta go to St. Louis now. There's the sign. So then Odell was like, okay, we gotta figure out when to leave. I wonder when's the best time to leave. We got so much to do. We got a plan for it. And then Ronald screamed out in pain again. And then on his hip, the word Saturday was scratched. Okay, cool. Now the demon wants us to leave on Saturday. I wonder how long we should stay. Apparently Odell asked out loud, how long? And then Ronald screamed again. And then scratched on his chest was 3.5 weeks. Maybe Odell should ask the demon where they should go for vacation. That thing could help them plan a really great trip. So all jokes aside, the demon, the evil entity, spirit, whatever is inside Ronald, wants them to go to St. Louis, leave on Saturday, and stay for about 3.5 weeks. And that's exactly what they did. So on March 5th, Ronald and his parents took an overnight train to St. Louis. At first, the Hunkelers stayed with Odell's side of the family, which were Lutheran, and one night, they decided to perform an alphabetical medium seance. So basically they sat around a table and they had a sheet of paper with the alphabet written on it, and then one person would be like the, I guess called the medium. So they would sit there and they would underline letters that, I guess whatever spirit was controlling them would talk through them, and then someone else with another piece of paper would write down all the letters that the other person was underlined, so it would eventually form some message. And apparently through this event they learned that it was Aunt Tilly who was possessing Ronald. And after this, a bed in another room like moved on its own and more scratches appeared on Ronald. So I'm not sure how true this part of the story is. Like, did the ABC seance actually happen, or is this another made up story? I have no idea. It sounds a little crazy. So the next day the Hunkelers decide to move in with Edwin's side of the family in their home, which consisted of Uncle Leonard, Aunt Doris, and 2 cousins. They lived in Belle Noire, which was located on the northwest side of St. Louis. So on this same day, there was actually no incident of any strange events happening. Odell started to wonder if she should enroll Ronald in a school in St. Louis since he had already been out of school for so long. When Odell told Ronald about this idea, Ronald opened up his pajama shirt and scratched on his chest said no school. And that same night, the normal, typical paranormal events started happening again. Like the bed was shaking, scratching noises, all that good stuff. On March 9th, the older cousin who goes to St. Louis University decided to tell her favorite teacher, Father Raymond Bishop, about the strange things that had been happening to her younger cousin, Ronald. Father Bishop was a Jesuit, and he had a strong feeling based on what the cousin had told him that Ronald was probably possessed. But of course he didn't tell her that. So that evening he called the Hunkelers and asked if he could come by to see what was going on for himself. So Ronald's parents told Father Bishop everything that had been happening to them since January 15th. And then Father Bishop walked around the house, he blessed each room, and he sprinkled holy water around the house. And then he said a special blessing over Ronald's bed. And apparently this special blessing was a low-level exorcism against infestation. And infestation is the lowest form of diabolical possession, and it's also the beginning. For example, the scratching and the thumping noises that they had been hearing initially at their home in Cottage City. Next comes oppression, which is where the physical attacks happen, like Ronald getting scratches all over his body, you know, like the ones that spell out Louis, the ones that spell out Saturday. It also includes sleep disturbances and depression, and makes it difficult for a person to function normally in their daily life. Like, for example, Ronald had to drop out of school because things were happening there and he couldn't concentrate. Next is the obsession phase, where a person just has a much harder time functioning in their daily life and they just have constant thoughts of the possession. And the final stage, which, spoiler, Ronald will eventually succumb to, is the full-blown possession. This is where the demon will break a person physically, mentally, emotionally, emotionally, spiritually. And this allows the demon to occasionally take control of somebody's body. That night, Father Bishop witnessed the strange events for himself. He saw the bed shaking, bouncing up and down. He heard the scratches in the mattress. Father Bishop sprinkled holy water on the bed, and then the bed stopped shaking. So Father Bishop pinned a relic onto Ronald's pillow, and then he left the house without any doubt in his mind that something supernatural and possibly evil was going on. And it's important to note that whenever the scratches appeared on Ronald, everyone claimed that his hands were always in sight. So like there was no way he could have done it himself. So the next day, Father Bishop tells Father William Bowdern about Ronald and his situation. And immediately, Bowdern is very interested. I mean, rightfully so. How often is it that a priest can witness someone who is demonically possessed? Father Bowdern was a priest at the St. Francis Xavier's Church. Try to say that 5 times fast. St. Francis Xavier Church. St. Francis Xavier's Church. St. Francis... Father Bowdern was described as a holy man with plenty of priestly experience. So Bishop thought he was the right guy to discuss this case with. On March 11th, both Father Bowdern and Father Bishop go to Ronald's uncle's house. They arrive around like 10 o'clock that night because, you know, they have normal jobs during the day, so they're busy all day. So the only time that they have to help Ronald is during the night, which is crazy because when the exorcisms start, it's wild how late these exorcisms will go. And then the priests just continue the next day with their normal duties without taking any time off. I would have been exhausted, which they were. Anyways, we'll get into that. It's just wild to me. So just like what Bishop did the first time, Bowdern talked to the family. He got all the information from what's been happening since January 15th. And soon after they arrived, Ronald got ready for bed. And as he was going to bed, everyone heard him yell for help. So they all rushed up to his bedroom, which was on the upstairs level. Ronald said that the relic that was pinned to his pillow by Father Bishop had unpinned itself and flew across the room. And then 2 scratches appeared on Ronald's arm in the sign of a cross. Bowdern said a prayer over Ronald and he also blessed him. Then he pinned another relic onto Ronald's pillow. And just as the priests were about to leave the house, they heard a loud crashing sound. So again, they all ran up into Ronald's room to see what was going on, and a bottle of holy water had flew somewhere from the dresser, I guess, across the room and crashed into the wall. So then Bowdern and Bishop said the rosary, which is a prayer, and eventually Ronald finally fell asleep, and the priest left the house at around 12:30 in the morning. And this was only just the beginning of many long, sleepless, exhausting nights. But even though the priest had left, the paranormal activity still continued. An entire bookcase had slid in front of Ronald's door. A stool in his room moved from one spot to another. And of course the bed began shaking like it always does. And the scratching sounds on the mattress were louder than ever. And who did Odell still think this was? She still thought it was Aunt Tilly. Like, why? Why would Aunt Tilly be doing any of this? Someone, please explain this to me. I think it was that same night, they decided to perform another seance. Not the ABC seance, but like I think just a regular seance. So everyone gathered around the table, I don't know, probably holding hands. They decided to ask Aunt Tilly some questions. And the questions weren't like, oh, why are you possessing my son? Why are you tormenting us? The questions were, where's the money? Apparently Aunt Tilly had some money hidden in this metal box, and there was a map located in the attic of her home. So is that what all this is about? Is Aunt Tilly like a pirate, and so they had to find this map which has an X on the spot to go find this money? This makes no sense at all. Who came up with the story? The priest did not think it was Aunt Tilly. I don't know if Odell even told them about that, but they thought it was a demonic possession. But they did also question like, was, you know, is a mental illness possibly, but because they're Catholic priests, their minds were kind of stuck on the idea of demonic possession. So how do you treat a demonic possession? Well, you perform an exorcism. So that's the next step. Even though they hadn't seen any traditional signs of demonic possession, Bishop and Bowdern still decided to go forward with trying to get an exorcism approved by the bishop. In this case, it was Archbishop Ritter. And while waiting for Ritter to approve the exorcism, Bowdern and Bishop were trying to find someone to be the exorcist because neither of them wanted to do it. They didn't think they were capable of performing an exorcism. Archbishop Ritter ended up approving the exorcism. He also chose Father Bowdern to be the exorcist. And also, Ritter told Bowdern not to discuss this with anyone else except for like other priests to like help him out. So Father Bowdern hit the books. He educated himself on how to perform an exorcism. He will be using the Rituale Romanum, which is one of the official books of the Catholic Church, and it was first written in 1614. And there's a section in that book that details how to perform an exorcism. There was a somewhat recent revision done on the Rituale Romanum, or the part about the exorcism maybe, that was done in 1999, and it placed more emphasis on distinguishing between a possession versus a mental illness. But in 1949, that wasn't the case. It does seem like Odell and Edwin at first did seek medical help for Ronald, but no one really told them, I guess, what was going on. So once they learned about religious intervention, demonic possession, exorcism, they were kind of stuck on that idea, like that would be the most reasonable explanation. Father Bowdern was having a hard time finding literature about exorcisms. There weren't too many detailed written accounts of exorcisms. A few cases here and there, especially like medieval, like old cases, but nothing very recent in like more modern times. Bowdern told Father Bishop to keep a meticulous diary of all the events that had happened to Ronald beginning in January 15th, and to write down all the events that will happen. And they hope that this diary, which they call a case study, could be used for future exorcists as like a how-to guide. But the issue with this diary is that a lot of the information from it come from eyewitness accounts, and apparently in research it has been shown that eyewitness accounts are not very reliable. Human memory is susceptible to errors due to many factors such as stress, passage of time, biases, and leading questions. So just keep that in mind. That's why I said earlier, take everything I tell you in this story with a grain of salt. March 16th, 1949, this will be the beginning of the exorcisms of Ronald Hunkeler, also known as Roland Doe, which the priest would refer him, I think in the diary, or either they said R. Roland Doe came about somehow. Father Bowdern needed somebody to be the muscles, to hold down Ronald if he started acting crazy. So he reached out to Walter Halloran. At the time was a 26-year-old student at St. Louis University, and he was already a Jesuit. But initially, Bowdern didn't tell Halloran about the exorcism. He just asked Halloran for a ride to a secret location. He didn't tell him where he was going or what he was doing yet. So Halloran agreed to drive him to this location. Apparently Father Bowdern didn't drive, so Halloran would kind of drive him around different places. So this was kind of usual thing, nothing new, but it was kind of late at night. It was around 9 o'clock when Halloran picked up Father Bowdern and Father Bishop, who were dressed in their priestly attire, and I'm sure Halloran was a little suspicious, but apparently he didn't ask any questions. He just drove them to where they needed to go. So when they arrived, Father Bowdern asked Halloran to come into the house with them because they're going to be performing an exorcism on a young boy, and he needs Halloran to hold the boy down. What in the manipulation is this? Asking Halloran to drive them somewhere, a little secret location, and to help with their secret exorcism. But of course Halloran agreed. I'm sure he kind of low-key wanted to see what would happen during an exorcism, to see a possessed boy for himself. Honestly, I'd be a little curious too. So the priests prepared themselves for the exorcism ritual. They donned all their priestly attire, they grabbed their holy water, they had their crucifix in the other hand, they were ready to go into battle. For this exorcism, Father Bowdern prepared all day. He said lots of prayers, he fasted, and he said a confession to another priest. One of the greatest risks for an exorcist during an exorcism is being possessed by the demon. So that's why Father Bowdern did what he did, to be as pure as possible, to be as free from as much sin as possible. Many priests before exorcisms do spend the day fasting and praying, and sometimes during long drawn out exorcisms, like over multiple days, multiple months, the exorcist will lose an unhealthy amount of weight. And spoiler, that does happen to Father Bowdern. So the priest, along with everybody else, goes upstairs where Ronald's room is so they can begin their first exorcism. Bowdern starts off by sprinkling Ronald's bed with holy water. Then he starts saying prayers in Latin, and then all of a sudden the bed starts moving up and down. And after Father Bowdern says Precipio TB, I'm sorry, I don't know, that was some Latin phrase, I don't know how to pronounce it. It sounds like a Harry Potter spell to me. Precipio TB, which means I command thee. After he said that, Ronald lets out a scream, and then he threw off the covers and he opens up his pajama shirt, and there are 3 long red welts on his stomach. And as Bowdern continued with the exorcism, more scratches appeared all over his body. And this happened after Father Bowdern said Dominus, which means Lord in Latin, and Deus, which means God in Latin. And then Father Bowdern commanded that the demon reveal itself, like what's its name. One report claims that they saw red welts appear on his leg, and it looked like it formed the shape of a devil. And then across his chest, the scratches spelled out the word hell. What the helly? And then more scratches appeared on Ronald's lower abdomen, which spelled out go. And Father Bishop took this as a sign that the demon may possibly leave Ronald's body by urine or excrement, by poop. Apparently this is a traditional exit route for demons leaving a possessed person's body. Learn something new every day. As the prayers continued, Ronald became more and more violent. He started punching the backboard of the bed, and then he took a pillow and started punching it. Ronald's mother, Odell, was shocked. She had never seen him so violent before. Apparently, Ronald had his eyes closed the entire time. He woke up when Father Bowdern sprinkled holy water onto his face. Ronald said he had been dreaming about fighting a big red devil. And then once the exorcism started back up again, Ronald went back to sleep. So he closed his eyes, which meant he was back in his possessed state, which they also called a spell. And it seemed like he was dreaming again and fighting because he was again thrashing around, punching. At this point, Halloran steps in and he holds down the boy because he's flailing around a lot. He was struggling to hold the boy down, so Ronald's uncle came in to help hold him down. And then at this point, Ronald starts spitting. He started spitting at everybody's face. And the way the books describe his spit, like there were big globs of like phlegm and that's nasty. That would have sent me right out the door. Ew, I cannot stand spit. Just reading about it or like trying to accidentally trying to picture it is disgusting. So Bowdern said one last long prayer, and at the end of it, Ronald was finally quietly sleeping. He was no longer thrashing around, no longer spitting, thankfully. So the exorcism ended at 5 o'clock the next morning. Just as the priests were about to leave the room, Ronald wakes up and he starts singing. So Bowdern starts praying again, and this time the exorcism finally ends at 7:30 in the morning. The exorcisms continued almost every single night from that night on. And I won't talk about each and every one in detail because for the most part they're kind of the same. Ronald would fight against everybody who restrained him. He would spit at everybody. He would cuss. He would sing. He would yell and scream. But as the exorcisms continued, Ronald just kept getting worse. He became more violent and he just became more frightening. But during the day, Ronald didn't show any signs of possession. He was like a normal 13-year-old boy. But once he would go to bed, that's when he would start acting possessed. And when he would wake up from his possessive episode, from his spell, he wouldn't remember any of it. During the third exorcism, Father Bowdern would say his usual prayers and Ronald would, act violent for a little bit, but then he would kind of go into a state of calmness. But during this exorcism, towards the end, Ronald sat up in his bed and it looked like he was gonna throw up. You know how cats kind of when they're trying to get up a hairball? Ronald was kind of doing that. And then he asked someone to open up a window. And then Ronald starts shouting, he's going. And then he says, there he goes.
There he goes.
Everyone thought it was over. Ronald got up, he went downstairs, he talked to the priest for a little bit, and the priest left at, I think, around 1:30 that morning. So the priests get back to where they're staying, and they're getting ready for bed, and then Father Bowdern's phone rings. And at this point, it's around 3:15 in the morning. The way I would have just let that phone ring, he picked it up, he answered, hello. And on the other end was one of Ronald's relatives, and they were frantic. They told Father Bowdern that Ronald was clutching his stomach, and he was shouting, he's coming back. So Bowdern gets out of bed, he go and grabs Father Bishop and Halloran, and they go back to the house to finish the exorcism. So the rest of the exorcism lasted until 7:30 that morning, and whenever Ronald woke up that day, he didn't remember anything. He went on with his day as normal. He apparently had no idea the chaos he was causing. But I guess it's not his fault if he's truly possessed, but if he's not possessed and it's a joke, it's a prank, then that is crazy. We'll talk about theories later at the end of the video, so keep watching till the end. Also real quick, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button because that'd be really cool. Thanks. So on March 19th, another exorcism takes place that night. Not only was Ronald cursing, spitting, fighting, this time he started urinating. This was new. He hadn't been doing this before. Every time Father Bowdern asked the demon and Ronald, like, when will you leave? Who are you? Ronald would urinate. And during this same exorcism, Ronald starts singing 2 new songs. One of them is called the Blue Danube. I don't know how to say it, my bad. And apparently he sang the song very well. The other songs that he sang before, he was like off key. He, wasn't singing it very well. But this time, apparently it sounded like he was a professional singer. It sounded very good. But then once Ronald woke up from his spell, Father Bishop asked Ronald to hum along to the tune of the Blue Danube song. But Ronald said he didn't know that song. So the next night, another exorcism was performed. In addition to everything that Ronald was doing, singing, cursing, spitting, fighting, urinating. This time he started to break wind, as Father Bishop described it in his diary. And if you don't know, breaking wind means tooting, farting, and apparently his fart smelled so bad they had to open up the window to let it air out. So around this time, Father Bishop and Father Bowdern thought it would be a good idea for Ronald to stay one night at the Alexians Brother Hospital. So the Alexians Brother Hospital was built by an order called the Congregation of Cellites. The order was founded by monks who cared for victims of the Black Death, which swept Europe in the 14th century. The Alexians opened their first hospital in Chicago in 1866, and they specialized in the treatment of men who they called back then idiots or lunatics. So I assume they were treating men with mental illnesses. And the brothers continued this specialty when they opened up the hospital in St. Louis in 1869. And a new wing on the building was built in 1874. And the original building became known as the Insane Department, which was the city's first psychiatric division in a general hospital. Chains and straitjackets were banned, but violent patients could be confined to a security room. Father Bowdern arranged for Ronald to stay in one of these security rooms on the 5th floor of the Alexian Brothers Hospital. Ronald was admitted to the hospital on March 21st, 1949. In the security room, the bed had straps for restraints. The windows had bars, and the door had no doorknob. So in order to get out, you had to loudly knock on the door, and one of the staff members from the other side would let you out. So that night, Father Bowdern performed another exorcism. For once, it was actually uneventful. Nothing happened. There was no spitting, cursing, fighting, urinating, none of that. Apparently, Ronald was awake the whole time, like his eyes were open, because he was scared about the room he was in. It was a strange place, somewhere new. So I guess in order for him to become possessed, he has to go to bed, go to sleep, which I find very suspicious. I'm not an expert in exorcism, but I thought it didn't matter whether you're awake or asleep when a demon can possess your body. So after this first night, they decided that he was good to go back home to his uncle's house. I think they should have kept him in there a couple more nights just to make sure, be on the safe side. Because also, demons have been known to trick people into thinking that they had left the person's body, but in fact, they're not gone, they're still there, and they're going to show up later with a surprise. So of course, that same night when Ronald was back home at his uncle's house, the same thing started happening. The bed was shaking, Ronald went to a spell. So this time, Father Bishop arrived to the house with 2 other unnamed priests, and nothing new happened. He acted his normal possessed way, and he eventually fell asleep sometime late that night. And around this time, Father Bowdern had an idea. Maybe if they convert Ronald to Catholicism, maybe it'll help in the fight to expel the demons from Ronald's body. So Ronald, along with his father, met Father Bowdern at the rectory at the St. Francis Xavier Church. Father Bowdern told Ronald all about the Catholic religion, and he even taught him a couple of prayers. So the next few exorcisms would take place at the rectory while Ronald was in the process of being converted to the Catholic religion. He would have to undergo confession, Holy Communion, and be baptized. So on March 23rd, another exorcism takes place. This time a new priest joins them in this exorcism by the name of Father William Van Roo. The exorcism begins as normal, Father Bowdern saying the prayers and Ronald reacting by fighting, spitting, farting. So like I mentioned before, when Ronald has his eyes closed, that means he's in one of his spells. But whenever he opened his eyes, it meant he was awake and he was like his normal self. So Ronald opens his eyes and he looks at Halloran and he says that he's hurting him from holding on to him so tightly. But Halloran knew better. He knew if he eased up his grip just a little bit, he would convert back to his possessed state and then attack them. But the new guy, Van Roo, who is superior to Halloran, told him to let go. And this is where Van Roo messed around and found out. Just as Halloran eased up his grip, Ronald takes his fist and punches him in the nose. And he breaks his nose. And very quickly after doing that, Ronald punches Van Roo in the nose. And he only makes his nose bleed he doesn't break his nose. So this exorcism ended at 2:30 in the morning, and Halloran left with a broken nose and Van Roo left with a bloody nose. March 25th, this would be the day that the demon would potentially leave Ronald's body. At least that's what Father Bowdern was hoping for. And why did he think this would be the day? Well, apparently during the very first exorcism on March 16th, an X appeared scratched on Ronald's body when Bowdern asked when the demon would leave. So both the priests thought that the X was like a Roman numeral symbol for the number 10. So they interpreted that the X meant that the demon would leave Ronald's body in 10 days. And so by Bowdern's count, that would mean March 25th. If you count March 16th as the first day, then 10 days later, that'd be March 25th. So this exorcism on March 25th started out as usual and it ended as usual, but this time Ronald was a bit calmer. Ronald did thrash around for a little bit, but he didn't say the nasty things that he usually says, and he wasn't trying to punch people in the nose. Father Bowdern really thought that the demon had actually left this time. Like, it was actually gone and the exorcism was successful. A few days go by and things seem back to normal. Ronald has no spells, no paranormal activity, no demonic possession symptoms. So now Ronald and his parents are planning to return back to Cottage City, Maryland, so they can resume their lives. But about a week after that last exorcism on March 31st, Ronald says he's not feeling well, and he asked everybody to come up to his room. He goes into a trance and he starts writing, like, writing words with his finger on the bed sheet. And while he's writing out these words, he's also saying them out loud. So the older cousin grabs a piece of paper and a pencil and she starts writing down everything that Ronald is saying. So apparently he says, "I will stay 10 days, but will return in 4 days. If Ronald stays, gone to lunch. If you stay and become a Catholic, it will stay away. Odell, period. God will take it away 4 days after it is gone. 10 days. Period. God is getting powerful. The last day when it quits, it will leave a sign on my front. Father Bishop, period. All people that mingle with me will die a terrible death." What does any of this mean? I have no idea. But of course, everyone is spooked, so they call up Father Bowdern to come over and, perform another exorcism. This time, Father Bowdern arrives with Father Van Roo. Why would he even want to come again after last time? So Ronald was still in his bed writing. Like, all he wanted to do was just write different messages. So they eventually gave him some paper and I guess a pencil to write on. He even wrote on the bed sheet too. And in one of his messages, Ronald reveals that he is being possessed by the devil. April 1st, 1949. This is the day that Ronald will be baptized. I didn't know this, but apparently a Catholic baptism is a form of exorcism. I think like a small little exorcism. Ronald, his parents, his older cousin, and his uncle Leonard are all in the car and they're driving to the St. Francis Xavier Church so he can be baptized. And on the way, Ronald, I guess, becomes possessed for a minute and then he jumps forward to the driver's side and he pulls on the steering wheel like he's trying to crash the vehicle. His uncle was able to pull the emergency brake and take control of the vehicle, and it just kind of parks on like a curb. And then Ronald turns to his mom and puts his hand around her throat. His father, Edwin, and then his uncle snatch Ronald out of the car and try to pin him down, calm him down for a bit. And then the older cousin takes control of the wheel and the mom moves up to the passenger side. So in the back seat, the uncle and his father can restrain Ronald. So they finally make it to the church in one piece, and Ronald is still acting up. He is cussing out loud, yelling, screaming. Father Bowdern decides that it would be best to perform the baptism in the rectory rather than the actual church. Bowdern did end up completing the baptism, but not without a fight. Ronald did not make it easy on anybody. He fought his way through the entire baptism. Father Bowdern soaked Ronald in holy water, like absolutely like drenched him in holy water, and he said the prayers in Latin that he needed to say for the baptism to be completed. And apparently it took about 4 hours to complete this baptism. But this baptism, which they thought was supposed to help expelling the demons, it seemed to make Ronald even more violent. He woke up the next morning and immediately began throwing a fit. So now Father Bowdern decided to do the Holy Communion. He attempted to place the host, which is a consecrated, oh, I don't know how to say the word, consecrated piece of bread, like a holy piece of bread that the priest like blessed, and he tries to put it in Ronald's mouth, but of course Ronald kept spitting it out. So after about the 5th try, Bowden was finally successful, so Ronald just completed his very first Holy Communion. So Ronald was finally driven home by another priest by the name of Father O'Flaherty, and this guy helped with the Holy Communion process. So Ronald seemed fine after the Holy Communion. Instead of acting with violence after the baptism, this time he was a little bit more calm. But that didn't last long, because while they were driving home, Ronald lunged forward and he put his hands around Father O'Flaherty's throat. So in the back seat, his dad and Father Bowden had to pull Ronald back and restrain him. When they got home, Ronald was kind of in and out. Like one minute he was normal, the next minute he would kind of just be sitting on the couch, just kind of like out of it, like he was in a trance or like sleeping. And that night, Father Bowden came back to perform another exorcism. He hoped that things would be better now that he had performed Holy Communion, baptism was done, I think he said his confessions, but unfortunately things got worse. Ronald sprinted downstairs, then he sprinted upstairs, he tore pages from the ritual book, he mocked the priest, and he mimicked the Latin words that they were saying. He laughed like a maniac and cursed all night long, said really nasty, obscene things, and more scratches appeared on his body, like a bunch of like parallel lines, and then also the number 18 appeared several times. I'm not sure if it was during this exorcism or another one, but at one point Ronald starts singing about his younger cousin, and he says over and over again, "You will die tonight, you will die tonight," which is very creepy. So someone, I don't know who, takes a pillow and shoves it in Ronald's face to shut him up, but of course the other family members had to pull off the person smothering Ronald. So basically things were getting very heated between everybody. It was just becoming too much. But after this incident, Ronald was very quiet. I'm sure it shook him up a bit. But once the priest left, Ronald became very feral again. So his father and his uncle decided to put gloves on his hands and wrap his hands up together with some heavy shipping tape. And then in another exorcism, Ronald woke up, he opened his eyes, he came out of his spell, and he said, "Please, please, take me home. Please, I can't stand it. I'm going crazy." This is the first time that Ronald seemed to know that he was in a spell, that he was possessed. Usually when he wakes up, he doesn't remember anything that just happened. Something's changing. A few days later, on April 4th, Ronald and his parents, along with Father Bowden and Father Van Roo, take an overnight train back to Cottage City, Maryland. And on the train, Ronald was acting normal during the day, but then at night he started acting up. Apparently he kept pressing the service call button, so the attendants would go to the room and try to figure out what do you need, but it was just Ronald being annoying and pressing the button over and over. So then Father Bowden told them to just ignore the call button. So they eventually arrived in Maryland on April 5th. And Father Bowden planned to continue the exorcisms like normal, but he preferred to do it in another, maybe safer location, like in a mental institute or a rectory of a church. But of course, before the exorcisms, he had to get permission again because they were in a new jurisdiction. So he asked Archbishop O'Boyle, and he was granted permission to continue the exorcisms. But when he was trying to find a safe place to perform the exorcisms, everybody denied Ronald. So he just had to do the exorcisms at the family home. And of course, nothing had changed. Ronald was still acting the exact same, spitting, cursing, urinating, farting, screaming, yelling, fighting. And then new scratches appeared on his body, which spelled out Christ, hell, spite, and a bunch of different numbers. So at this point, Bowden thought it would be a good idea to take Ronald back to St. Louis so he could be admitted back to the Alexian Brothers Hospital. So on April 9th, they take an overnight train to go back to St. Louis. On Palm Sunday, April 10th, Ronald is admitted back to the Alexian Brothers Hospital, where he will be staying in the security room. So of course that night on Palm Sunday, another exorcism was performed. And just like the very first time Ronald was admitted to this hospital, it was very uneventful. Nothing happened. So this time, Ronald wasn't just staying one night. He would be staying several nights. And at one point, a guy named Brother Rector Cornelius, who was the monk in charge of the hospital, he called in a non-Catholic pediatrician to observe observe Ronald and see if he could find some natural explanation as to what was causing these things to happen to Ronald. Apparently, the pediatrician saw the scratches on Ronald, he observed his sudden mood shifts, apparently he observed convulsions, and he even saw objects move on their own. And allegedly, the pediatrician told Cornelius, I can't give you a natural explanation for this. But again, I don't know how true that part of the story is. I'm not sure if that even happened. So, of course, another exorcism was performed the next night on April 11th. This time it was eventful. Scratches appeared on Ronald's chest and it spelled out exit. And there was also an arrow scratched on his body that was pointing towards his wee-wee. And then, at the same time, Ronald started urinating and he said it was burning. Father Bowden was really hoping that the devil was leaving Ronald's body through his urine. At one point, Ronald was able to get one of his hands out of one of the restraints and he punched it's not funny. And he punched Father Bowden in the no-no spot and he said something along the lines of, that's a nutcracker, ain't it? Some reports, those not written in the diary, said that they saw Ronald, while he was in the restraints, arch his back so much that his head touched his feet. He kind of formed a circle. So the next night, another exorcism was performed. And this time, the devil in Ronald said, I am the devil. I will wake him up and he will be pleasant. You will like him. And then Ronald instantly wakes up and he is pleasant. He's nice. He's eerily sweet. And then all of a sudden he goes back into a spell, closes his eyes, and then the devil says, I am the devil. This time I will wake him up and he will be awful. And then Ronald wakes up and he is cranky, whiny, and cursing. So it seems like the exorcisms are not working, nothing's changing, but he's still at the hospital and they're going to continue to perform the exorcisms, hoping that eventually they will weaken the devil and he'll be casted out of his body. On April 13th, Halloran, along with another Jesuit student by the name of Barney Hasbrook, decided to take Ronald on a trip to the White House. And no, I'm not talking about the White House in Washington, D.C. This is a Jesuit retreat center in St. Louis, which they call the White House. It sits on 75 acres of land along the bluffs of the Mississippi River. So Halloran and Hasbrook show Ronald around the estate. They walk along a path that leads them to the Stations of the Cross, which are large white statues that commemorate Jesus' last hours when he carried the cross through Jerusalem and up the hill of Calvary where he was crucified. Things were going actually really well. Halloran was teaching Ronald all about the Catholic faith and all about the statues and their meaning. But as the path got closer to the edge of the bluff where the ground just drops off into the Mississippi River, Halloran started to become very nervous. So he tried to speed up the tour, but once they got to the 11th station called Jesus is Nailed to the Cross, Ronald freaks out and he takes off running. And where does he start running towards? He starts running towards the cliff. Halloran sprints after him and he's able to catch up to the boy and tackle him to the ground, and him and Hasbrook are able to put him back into the car and take him back to the hospital. And once they got back to the hospital, Ronald was fine. He was very calm, as if nothing had happened. And of course that night when another exorcism was performed, Ronald was back into his rage, acting wild. But also that same night, on that exorcism, the devil in Ronald said that God told him to leave at 11 o'clock that night. 11 o'clock hit, but nothing happened. But the next few days, which included Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday, were peaceful. Ronald didn't have any violent outbursts. On Easter, April 17th, Ronald received Holy Communion at 6:30 that morning. And at first he refused, but eventually he did take it. But then right after, he started to act out again, and a few nurses had to come in and restrain him. Another exorcism was performed that night, and Ronald was becoming more and more scary. He started to threaten to kill the nurses that were restraining him. And during this exorcism, he asked for a knife. And of course no one gave him one, because that would be dumb. Bowden was not expecting to perform an exorcism on Easter, which was a holy day, but it seemed like a turning point. The devil inside Ronald was speaking more frequently and more authoritatively. On April 18th, 1949, the day after Easter, Ronald woke up and chose violence. He continued to be a menace, starting at 8 o'clock that morning. He tried to kick one of the nurses. He threw a bottle of holy water at them. Ronald was given Holy Communion that morning, but he would not accept it. Instead, a spiritual communion was attempted, where he would just have to say, I want to receive you in Holy Communion. So he didn't have to take the host in his mouth, he just had to say those words. So Ronald eventually did actually say those words, but also the devil inside of him said that he must make 9 more communions and then the devil will leave. So of course the priest that was doing the communion with him attempted to do it 9 more times, but Ronald would not cooperate. And also, right before the priest left, the devil in Ronald said he must say one word, but he won't allow him to say that one word. Like, okay, whatever that means. So once that priest left, Ronald was just acting crazy. He was apparently urinating, I think sometimes vomiting, cussing, and threatening the nurses. They tried to calm him down. They brought him a glass of milk, a piece of cake, and some ice cream. Like, that would make me so happy. But Ronald ended up just taking the glass of milk and throwing his plate, shattering everything. He was just acting like a spoiled little boy. So Father Bowden arrived later that night with a few other priests to perform another exorcism. It started off as usual, Father Bowden saying his prayers in Latin. Ronald was reacting with violence, but something was just a little different. Ronald would occasionally wake up and he would ask about the Latin language, prayers, communion. Father Bowden begins another prayer. Ronald is back into his little spell, but then as he begins this other prayer, Ronald sits up and he says in a new, different voice, "Satan, Satan, I am Saint Michael, and I command you, Satan, and the other evil spirits, to leave the body in the name of Dominus. Now, now, now." Dominus, that's the word that the devil didn't want Ronald to say. And again, in Latin, Dominus means Lord. And right after Ronald had said this, he fell back into a very long convulsion, which apparently lasted for like 10 minutes. Then he sat up and he said, he's gone. The devil is gone. It was finally over. Ronald told everybody that he had a vision of a beautiful figure with flowing, wavy hair standing in a brilliant white light. He wore a white garment and it seemed to be made of mail, like what knights wore back in the medieval times. In his right hand, this angel-like figure held a fiery sword, and with his other hand, he was pointing down towards a cave where the devil stood within flames, and he was surrounded by other demons. And the angel faced the demon, and he said the word Dominus. And after the angel said that, the devil and the demons ran back into the cave, and then bars came over the cave, like locking the cave so they couldn't come back out. So that was the vision that Ronald had. And also that same night, apparently at the St. Francis Xavier Church, the Jesuits saw a blaze of light fill the space above the altar, and apparently they saw Saint Michael, the archangel, holding a fiery sword. The next morning, the boy woke up and he was completely normal. He apparently didn't remember anything from the times that he was acting possessed. And later that day, he took a nap, and when he woke up, a loud explosion could be heard through the hospital. Everyone went running up to the 5th floor and looked in the room where Ronald was at, and they saw him sitting up in the bed, and he was just smiling, like, you know, like, look at me. I don't know, it's kind of weird to think that he was just sitting there smiling. Like, he's in a room, I assume, by himself at that point, because he was just taking a nap, and he's just sitting up in bed, he's smiling. Smiling at what? I don't know, it's just in my head. Maybe I've seen so many scary movies that's just like a little eerie scene to just picture. I feel like this is where the movie ends, and then you know there's gonna be like a part 2. But fortunately for Ronald, there will not be a part 2 because it is all over. He is no longer possessed. So once Ronald left the hospital, they permanently locked that room, and no one was ever to stay in that security room. Ronald and his parents returned home 12 days later after the last exorcism. Father Bowden wrote to Ronald in May of 1949, and Ronald wrote back and said that he was happy and they had a new dog. Reverend Scholes dropped by their house one day and was wondering why he hadn't seen them at church. And they explained to Scholes that Ronald had been converted to Catholic, and they too, the parents, which I guess the father was already Catholic, but the mom, Odell, and maybe grandmother Anna, will also be converted to Catholic at some point. Later that year, on August 9th, 1949, Scholes decided to tell the Washington, D.C. branch of the Society of Parapsychology about what had happened to Ronald. He was not going to keep it a secret. Even though all the Jesuits who were involved in the exorcisms were sworn to secrecy, they weren't going to tell anybody about these exorcisms, Scholes decided to tell what he saw from his personal experience with Ronald. Apparently, a journalist or a reporter was at this meeting, so when they found out about this boy being allegedly possessed, they wrote an article, and after that first article, the media went crazy with this story. And then at some point, someone leaked some information about the exorcisms that happened in St. Louis, so different articles came out with more and more new information about the possession and the exorcisms of the haunted boy, which at this time they didn't know who it was because his identity was thankfully kept a secret. The first article about Ronald, aka Roland Doe, was first published on August 10th, 1949 by the Washington Post. The article was titled, "Pastor Tells Eerie Tale of Haunted Boy." It described a 13-year-old boy haunted by this unexplainable phenomena. Later that same day, the Evening Star published an article titled, "Minister Tells Parapsychologist Noisy Ghost Plagued Family." So in this article, they just talked about like poltergeist type activity, not really that he was possessed. I don't think they really knew about the exorcism yet at this point. But eventually, like I said, someone leaked out information about the exorcism, so eventually the articles became obsessed with the idea that there was a boy who was possessed and underwent exorcisms. On August 19th, the Evening Star published another article which they titled, "Priest Freed Boy of Possession by Devil." And so this was the first public details of the exorcisms. And then the next day, on August 20th, the Washington Post published their own article, which was a very lengthy, detailed one about the exorcisms, which they titled, "Priest Frees Mount Rainier Boy Reported Held in Devil's Grip." And this would be the article that would later inspire William Peter Blatty's novel, The Exorcist, which eventually became a very famous and terrifying movie. Was Ronald really possessed? The Catholic Church never made an official statement, but Archbishop Ritter in St. Louis did appoint an examiner to investigate the case. The examiner did publish a very small story in the Catholic Review. Despite there being allegedly 48 witnesses, the examiner concluded that Ronald was not possessed. He cited psychiatrists' opinions, and he leaned more towards the theory of poltergeist activity. The house where many of the exorcisms took place in Belle Noire near St. Louis was sold by Ronald Hunkeler in 1951. At one point there was an interview with Doris Hunkeler, Ronald's aunt, and she stated that strange things still happened in the house, like objects moved around on their own and doors opened and closed. Troy Taylor, the author of The Devil Came to St. Louis, even visited the house for himself in 2008 for a radio show where they had contestants who had to stay in that room where the exorcisms took place, and whoever lasted the longest would receive a prize. And those who participated in the contest and who had to stay in that room claimed that the door rattled, they saw shadowy figures, and even Troy reported that he felt this like electrical sensation when he stepped into the room. And at the Alexian Brothers Hospital, that room where the exorcism took place on the 5th floor, the security room, was locked forever. Only the older staff remembered what happened in that room. They remember hearing the crazy laughter, hearing the screams and the yelling. Demolition began on that portion of the hospital in 1976, and work began on a new building a short distance away. In 1978, workers began dismantling the former psychiatric ward where the infamous exorcist room was located. Before demolishing the building, all the rooms had to be cleared out, so they unlocked the exorcist room, and somebody opened one of the drawers of, there was like a table or nightstand in there, and they saw some papers. Apparently, these papers were part of the diary that Father Bishop had been writing. So these pages ended up being given to one of the Jesuits' brothers who was a lawyer, so he locked it away in a safe place. And then the furniture in the room was sold to a nursing home and was kept on the 4th floor. And apparently people did not like to go on the 4th floor of this nursing home. I don't really know if there's any stories, but I don't know if this part is even true, because apparently there's another version of what happened to the furniture in the exorcist room. Another story says that it was placed in an unnamed rectory in the basement, and then eventually that rectory was to be demolished, so they took out the furniture and then eventually placed it in a storage unit somewhere in Illinois. I don't know if it's still there or not. What happened to the furniture? Who knows? So some more fun stories about the Alexian Brothers Hospital. Apparently when the psychiatric ward, that part of the building, was demolished, the exorcist room floated for a bit in the air before it came crashing down with the rest of the building. And also, before the demolishing happened, when nurses would walk past that room, they would feel this cold chill. Some people said that they could hear whispering from inside that room, even though no one was in there. There have been several movies, shows, and documentaries inspired by the case of Ronald Hunkeler. The most famous one is obviously The Exorcist, which was based off Blatty's book, which was inspired by a newspaper article about the possession and exorcism of Ronald, and the book called Possessed by Thomas Allen. There was also a movie that was based off that book as well. I have yet to watch it, but I probably plan to watch it, and you'll probably see some clips in this video so you can kind of have a visual. So I know what you're probably thinking. What the heck happened to Ronald after he was successfully exorcised? Well, he went on to live a very normal life. He graduated from college with degrees in chemical engineering and also a degree in psychology. I wonder why he got a degree in psychology. That's very interesting that he would get that degree, and then going through what he went through as a kid. I don't know, I'm just making an assumption, but I wonder if he got that degree to better understand what he went through. It doesn't seem like he used that degree, but he used his chemical engineering degree because he ended up getting a job with NASA in Maryland, and he even patented a thing called foamed in place ceramic insulating material. So this substance was used on space vehicles to prevent them from burning up when they re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. But unfortunately, he did pass away in 2021, just before his 85th birthday. To this day, the nature of the events that took place in 1949 still remain a mystery. Only Ronald truly knows what happened, but he never spoke publicly about it. Many people tried to reach out to him, but he didn't want to talk to them about it. It was just, I guess, a touchy subject. Whether it was like a joke or not, it obviously escalated into something that seemed traumatic for everybody, so I could see why he didn't want to talk about it. Or maybe he was ashamed if it was a prank and now he feels guilty about it, but I don't know. All we have are newspaper articles, interviews, and a diary filled with eyewitness accounts, each offering an incredible and sensational glimpse into one of the most disturbing cases of alleged demonic possession in modern times. Naturally, humans are curious creatures. We want to know what happened. Was it supernatural? Was it paranormal? Is there a logical explanation for what happened? No one really knows, but there are some theories out there that potentially could explain what happened. So let's dive into the big ones. And when we're done, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Some people believe Ronald faked the entire ordeal. Maybe he was just a troubled kid, desperate for attention. He didn't want to go to school anymore, so he made all of this up. Maybe he thought it would be funny at first, but then it kind of spiraled out of his control. Skeptics do point out that there weren't many resources about exorcisms back then, so it'd be really hard for him to fake a possession if he doesn't really know like what that would even look like. Apparently, Ronald's childhood best friend did not buy into the possession. He even described Ronald as smothered by his mom and his grandmother. He wasn't very popular at school. He was kind of shunned by other kids. Maybe he was bullied, but apparently he also bullied other kids as well. To him, attention seeking seemed more reasonable than demonic possession. Even in the article by Mark Opsasnick titled The Haunted Boy of Cottage City, he concluded that Ronald was a clever trickster who pulled pranks to scare his mother and other kids. And also Joe Nickell, who was the author of a magazine article titled Exorcism, Driving Out the Nonsense, he agreed and said that there was simply no credible evidence of him being possessed, and that symptoms of possession can be childishly simple to fake. And apparently in 2021, Ronald's companion told the New York Post that he wasn't possessed at all, that it was all concocted. And apparently Ronald told that person, the companion, he was just a bad boy. So if that is true, what this person is saying, then Ronald pulled off probably one of the greatest hoaxes of all time. Like his prank, if that's what it really was, inspired one of the greatest horror films ever, The Exorcist. But I can't help but think his confession to his companion is maybe a lie. Like, what if claiming that it was a prank was easier than admitting that maybe he was truly possessed by the devil? Because that latter part, pretty terrifying. Maybe Ronald was a human agent for poltergeist activity. In paranormal theory, poltergeists, which again means noisy ghost, aren't really ghosts at all. They're thought to be psychic energy unleashed by emotionally troubled young people. usually around the age of puberty. And this subconscious energy apparently can make like doors slam, objects move, noises, strange noises start happening like scratching, thumping. And Ronald apparently fits this profile perfectly. He was at the time a 13-year-old boy, an adolescent, apparently in a troubled home. Psychologist Sergio Rueda, I don't know if I said that right, I'm sorry. He argued that the priests were too quick to jump into the idea of demonic possession. And he thinks that the strange events could be explained by poltergeist activity combined with psychological stress. So do I believe in poltergeist activity? Honestly, I don't know. I've personally never experienced anything like that, but I've also never researched the topic before. The only time I've ever really heard that word is in that older movie literally called Poltergeist. But maybe I should do a deep dive on the topic because it'd be interesting to learn more. Another explanation is psychological rather than paranormal. Over the years, psychiatrists have suggested that Ronald maybe suffered from Tourette syndrome, OCD, or childhood schizophrenia, or even dissociative identity disorder. Back in the 1940s though, mental health care was primitive. A kid like Ronald was simply labeled high-strung, and psychiatric treatment was way different back then than it is now. Some might call it barbaric because they focused a lot on electroshock therapy and lobotomies. And there were even some dark rumors. Some old friends of Ronald claimed that Ronald confided to them that he was essayed by his grandmother. There's no evidence that this is true, so I don't know if that actually happened, but if it did, then this could definitely explain his disturbing behavior. But I really hope it's not true, because that is really messed up. But what we do know is that Ronald was an only child. He was allegedly spoiled by his mother and allegedly smothered by his grandmother. And allegedly his father was not around that much because I guess he was working a lot. And apparently this concoction can result in a dysfunctional young boy. In biblical times, when Jesus would cast out devils, it may have been that he was actually healing people from different diseases. It could have been mistranslated as he was performing exorcisms. Modern Catholic theologians note that the difference between demonic possession and mental illness is simply terminology. What was once called possession may now just be psychosis, schizophrenia, or another type of mental illness. Some people believe that Ronald's possession was nothing more than contagious hysteria. The family's deep-rooted faith, combined with the priest's belief that the boy was actually possessed, may have created this powerful delusion, one that convinced everybody that Ronald was possessed by the devil. And this mass hysteria caused Ronald to imitate the behaviors of someone who is possessed. The more prayers, rituals, and fear were poured out around him, the more convincing his torment seemed. But even if Ronald had one, if not multiple mental illnesses, how did all of them suddenly just disappear once he was successfully exorcised? Like after the final exorcism, he left the hospital and was perfectly fine. He lived what seemed like a normal life. And finally, the theory that was held by the family and the priest is that Ronald was actually demonically possessed by the devil himself. Based on the diary, many people believe that Ronald exhibited the classic stages of possession: infestation, oppression, obsession, and then possession. And let's not forget about the 48 witnesses who truly believe that Ronald was possessed. Some people claim they saw supernatural things happen, such as Ronald levitating. At one point he kind of flew in the air, and he also touched the ritual book and it dissolved into little pieces of confetti. Are those exaggerations? Probably. But they added fuel to the legend and made the story even more interesting. But another witness to these events, good old Walter Halloran, the one who got punched in the nose, he did a bunch of interviews, and he always said that he could never make a statement on whether or not Ronald was possessed. But he did admit several interesting things. Apparently he never heard the boy speak in Latin. He only heard Ronald mimic a few words in Latin because Father Bowden and other priests were saying these Latin words over and over and over. So eventually you kind of pick up on them. And the boy's voice did not change very much. It never got too deep, too raspy, not like a crazy possessed demon-like voice. And the boy did not show insane amount of strength. Even though he was fighting, had to have two people typically restrain him. It was just 13-year-old boy who was thrashing around with all his might. I'm sure it's hard to control a human being who is trying to fight you. And apparently, he never saw the bed shake on its own. There was only one time the bed moved, but that's because someone leaned on it. Also, he never saw the boy urinate or vomit anywhere. But he did apparently spit a lot. Like, that was true. And he was very accurate with his spitting, but another person, I think a childhood friend, said that they would practice spitting and they were really good at it because they practiced doing it. I think it was just like a young teenage boy kind of thing. But Halloran did see the scratches on the boy's body, and he was a bit baffled as to how they got there because he always saw the boy's hands and he never saw him like scratch himself, you know? But there could maybe be a logical explanation for this. There's a thing called dermatographia, which is a skin condition where red raised welts can appear on someone's body very easily by just light pressure, light scratching. I don't know if the boy just kind of like would just quickly like brush over his body without anyone really noticing, especially if he was fighting around all the time. But spell out specific words, I don't know how that could happen unless he just did it without anyone like looking at him. So to be honest, it's truly a mystery in my eyes what happened to Ronald. Like, was it a true demonic possession, a youngster playing a prank and fooling everybody, poltergeist activity that escalated as the boy was undergoing exorcisms and being locked away in a security room, or a troubled boy suffering from a mental illness? No matter what it was, something unexplainable did happen to Ronald Hunkeler in 1949. And what do I believe? Honestly, I feel like he was most likely suffering from some sort of mental illness. Or maybe initially he was trying to like prank people and then it just kind of escalated out of his control. But I also kind of like the idea of poltergeist activity. I don't know if that's really a true thing that can happen, but it seems to be kind of a research thing. I haven't looked into the research yet, but very interesting idea. But to be honest, I truly don't believe he was possessed by the devil. You may think differently, and that's fine. But enough about what I think. I do want to know what you think. Do you believe Ronald was possessed, or do you think it was something else? Mental illness, poltergeist, a prank? Let me know in the comments. Whatever you believe, don't forget to hit that like button and that subscribe button for more spooky, unexplainable, creepy, and haunting stories. Thanks for watching this episode of Spooky Time with April, and as always, stay safe and stay spooky. See you next time.